Hello and welcome to today's webinar on the ethics of human challenge studies for COVID-19. I'm Claudia Emerson. I am the director of the Institute on Ethics and Policy for Innovation at McMaster University, and I will be moderating today's session. This is the third webinar in the series from the Public Health Emerging Preparedness and Response Ethics Network, affectionately known, which is a recently launched initiative from the World Health Organization, which brings together a global community of bioethics scholars that are prepared to provide ethics support during emergency public health emergencies. The network has garnered a lot of attention and is ever growing, and now together with our co-host, the Global Health Network, has now over 700 COVID-19 resources on its website. So this is truly fantastic. Many thanks to Catherine Littler at the World Health Organization, the PHEFRIN Network, and the Global Health Network for this incredible work. I want to let everyone know that this is being recorded. We have an hour for today's session, and we will have three panelists speaking today. Each of them will have 10 minutes to present. I'm going to introduce them each, and then I will hand over the floor to our first speaker. I'm asking the audience to please generate your questions via the chat function, and I will do my very best to make sure that we cover as many of your questions as possible. Now, I am hoping and I imagine that we will have a lot of great questions and discussion. Today's topic on the COVID-19 human challenge studies and whether we ought to be doing them has generated a lot of excitement and a lot of controversy. This is a topic that has garnered much discussion among the scientific community and in the media and among the ethics community, and indeed lots of debate, including some division around whether we ought to be doing these studies. Human challenge studies are studies wherein healthy human volunteers are intentionally infected with a pathogen of interest, in this case, SARS-CoV-2, and where researchers can then monitor and observe disease progression and the infection, and in the case of testing and intervention, such as a vaccine, can observe whether the vaccine is actually working. Now, in our current situation, we have over 100 vaccine candidates in the field under development. So a human challenge study is thought to be one of the ways in which we can down select and choose the most promising candidates among those vaccine candidates to move forward into larger efficacy trials. Indeed, proponents of human challenge studies have argued that we could save quite a bit of time. We've all heard the plausible time, 12 months, 18 months before we get a viable, potentially effective vaccine out into the population. And so with a human challenge study helping us identify the most promising candidates, the idea is we could save some time and expedite this, potentially 1 month and up to 3 months. Now, in the current situation where we have now over 4.7 million infections globally, over 300,000 deaths, saving a little bit of time, even just 1 day, would make a significant difference. However, this is of course the controversial part of these studies. So it seems counterintuitive that in a situation where over 4 billion people globally right now are under some sort of quarantine or isolation, restrictive measures of some sort in order to avoid infection, that we are proposing to bring in people and to infect them. And then of course, there is this concern around the risk is too high. This is a novel coronavirus. We simply don't know enough. We're learning every day about what this virus is all about, but the risk is high, despite the fact that we know that COVID-19 manifests itself asymptomatically and possibly in a mild form in healthy adult volunteers. The possibility of progressing to severe disease and death even is there, and so some say the risk is just too high. However, there are many who are willing to take this risk, and we are going to learn a little bit more about that today. So I am now going to introduce our panelists, and I am going to invite them. I'm going to invite them to speak each for 10 minutes. I would ask the audience to send in your questions via chat function, and I will try to open up the discussion and get as many of them in at the end. So our first speaker, I'd like to welcome Dr. Zeb Jamrozik from Monash Bioethics Center at Monash University. Zeb is a physician and a bioethicist who has done a lot of thinking and writing on the ethics of human challenge studies, and very recently was a member of the working group that developed the guidance from the World Health Organization for conducting human challenge studies of COVID-19, setting out key criteria, and indeed Zeb was one of 2 members of that working group that drafted the guidance. Thank you very much, Zeb, and welcome. We're delighted to have you. It's late there at home where you are, so thank you so much for joining us. Our second speaker is Professor Seema Shah, who is Associate Professor of Pediatric and Founders Board Professor of Medical Ethics at Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago and Northwestern University. Likewise, Seema has also done considerable work in the ethics of human challenge studies, also serving on that WHO working group that produced the guidance. Seema also chaired the panel of experts that produced a report on Zika challenge studies in 2016, and has recently published a paper appearing in Science just 2 weeks ago, laying out some of the ethics issues around human challenge studies. Seema, good morning to you there in Chicago. Thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome. And our last speaker today is Josh Morrison. Josh is based in New York City, and Josh is the co-founder of One Day Sooner. And One Day Sooner is this amazing initiative where over now, at last count, I checked just before I joined online, there are over 20,000 volunteers willing to submit to human challenge studies in over 102 countries. So this has turned into a little bit of a movement itself. And so we look forward to hearing from Josh about what it would mean from the perspective of a participant in a human challenge trial. All right, I'm going to hand the floor over to you, Zeb. Zeb, you have the floor.
Thanks, Claudia, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm just going to try to share my PowerPoint, hopefully. Does that look good? Can you see that, Claudia? Maybe not. All good, great.
Yeah, it looks good.
So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to a few aspects of the ethics of this research. I'm going to talk a bit about scientific justification and also about some concerns about risks and possible uncertainties. Some of what I'm expressing today is consistent with what the working group expressed, but some of it is personal views. So that's just a disclaimer. Where we are today, as many of you know, and as Claudia alluded to, is that basically the entire world is affected by public health restrictions. There's over 4 million cases, over 300,000 deaths, 100 vaccines in development, and 3 have already gone into phase 1 clinical trials. And we have no treatments with publicly available data, despite announcements by the manufacturers of one treatment. One possibility is that one of the first vaccines might be shown to be highly effective and safe. We might get lucky. And in which case you might think there'd be less scientific justification for challenge studies, and that might be so. But many people think that because that's definitely not something we can count on, that it's at least reasonable to think we should be planning challenge studies in the meantime, because the other possibilities are that the first vaccines turn out to be moderately effective, like seasonal influenza vaccines, which are about 30 to 50% effective, or they turn out to be not effective, or they turn out to be unsafe. Another possibility is that we try to do a standard field trial with one of the first vaccines or several of the first vaccines, and for various reasons that field trial doesn't work out. For example, this happened with Zika vaccine trials, which were planned to be done during the Zika epidemic, but were ultimately not possible to be done. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And another possibility is that even if we have a moderately effective vaccine or no vaccine, in any case, there's so many candidates. On the one hand, that's good. But on the other hand, it makes it quite difficult to test multiple candidates in large field trials, which would plausibly take hundreds of thousands of people. So the broad kind of scientific justification for doing challenge studies with SARS-CoV-2 would be, on the one hand, vaccine testing. So either getting vaccines developed faster, selecting better vaccines, so more efficacious vaccines, or there might be situations where the only way to test vaccines is through challenge studies. For example, in countries that are in lockdown, it's not possible to do a field trial. The other broad type of justification is to improve scientific knowledge. There's a lot we don't know about this pathogen, and if we knew more about immunity to SARS-CoV-2, infection with this virus and its transmission, then we could control it better from a public health point of view, whether or not we had a vaccine. So those are important things that we could learn from challenge studies. A standard way challenge studies are used is where we have multiple vaccine candidates. So this is a standard vaccine development pipeline that starts off with preclinical development, phase 1 and 2 studies, which are fundamentally about safety. And then if we have multiple vaccines to test, a challenge study could be used to select the most promising candidate or candidates, so several vaccines potentially, but less vaccines than we started out with in the pool, and then do field trials with that reduced number of vaccines, then proceed to standard licensure and post-market surveillance. There's been a very daring proposal put on the table by Lurie et al. That challenge studies could be used alone without a field trial and with expanded safety testing to apply to a regulator for an emergency use authorization. But I've left those arrows in orange there because it's fair to say this is quite controversial. In particular, it would need to have very clearly defined ways of collecting safety and efficacy data after use of that vaccine. But the third way that challenge studies might be used would be, for example, if we have a moderately effective first vaccine or several vaccines to test, we could, for example, compare a licensed vaccine with the other vaccine candidates, and we could potentially get from a moderately effective vaccine to much more effective vaccines. And if we had a vaccine that was 20% more effective and it's used by 5 billion people, well, that would be a huge public health benefit, for example. So those are ways that challenge studies can accelerate or improve the vaccines that we ultimately develop. And the way it can save time is by moving the decisions about manufacturing and other aspects of vaccine development further back in time as soon as we have the results of the challenge study. And that applies to all three different proposals there. But many people's response to this is, why don't you just do standard trials like vaccine field trials? And that seems like a plausible question, but it's not so straightforward. The first reason is that there are practical constraints. A big one is time. As Claudia mentioned, every bit of time we shave off development matters here. A second practical constraint is that there are too many vaccines to test. And if we have to do a field trial with 10,000 people for every vaccine, and there are more than 10 vaccines to test, that ends up being a lot of participants. And so a very difficult set of trials to run. So not only does it involve lots of participants, but plausibly field trials with SARS-CoV-2 vaccines are going to require quite intensive sampling, regular nasal swabbing of participants and so on. So they're not simple vaccine trials. And the third constraint is that field trials ultimately can only take place where there's active transmission of the virus. And so that means field trials have to be very precisely timed with an epidemic and with local public health measures. And I'll show you a bit why that matters. A colleague of mine here in Melbourne has modeled this question. And this is a graph of, on the left, the duration of field trials in days, where the black line that's horizontal running through the slide is the 1 year duration of field trial. And 1 year is a long time to wait for a result on a vaccine. And the horizontal axis there is the effective reproduction number, or R, which many of you might have heard about during this epidemic or before, with the goal of public health measures being to reduce the effective reproduction number below 1, so that the number of secondary infections with the virus gradually decreases. The problem with that is, when society is under lockdown, a field trial cannot be conducted because we don't have enough infections occurring to know whether the vaccine's effective or not. So this modeling study that my colleague did suggested that the ideal R for field trials was between 1.14 and 1.16. But it can be very difficult to hold the R at that level, because if it goes above that, we're in the so-called herd immunity strategy, which has been very controversial and involves large amounts of cases in the community. And if we start doing the field trial too late in the epidemic, we can't get a result. So as those lines go up there, the duration of the field trial becomes infinitely long and we can't get a result. So that leaves us with a very restricted set of places where we could do a field trial. For example, we couldn't do one in Australia right now where I am, where the R is below 1 or around 1. We just couldn't do a field trial even though we have vaccines being developed here. So one plausible response is that we could do them in Sweden or countries that have only a moderate degree of lockdown. This is the graph of the effective reproduction number in Sweden. And if they keep it in that range, that would be perfect for field trials possibly. But the problem is there aren't many countries like Sweden, and you need to have very tight control of the virus to keep it in that level where we could do a field trial. A second possibility is that we could do field trials in places that choose to relax their restrictions quickly, like these protesters in Florida would like to do. But some problems with that are it's very difficult to time the field trial with an epidemic. It can be difficult to identify people who've never been infected using serology testing. And some people might even worry that there are justice implications here. You know, should we be doing research that involves a lot of burdens in communities that are already burdened by significant epidemics? And even worse from a justice point of view is the third possibility, which is doing field trials in places that aren't able to do social distancing, which are mostly in the global south. And these have been appropriately ruled out by the WHO Director General because of problems with injustice and exploitation. And it would also be very difficult from a practical point of view, timing it with an epidemic. It's worth noting that I'm talking about where field trials could be conducted, but in our working group key criteria for challenge studies, we suggested that challenge studies, at least initially, should be conducted only in centers that have significant experience doing challenge studies and that are able to provide high quality care and full risk minimization to participants. And the reason for that is that, as Claudia mentioned, in young people, the risks are very low, but they're still there. We need to be careful when we're quoting risks about this virus to always quote them with an age range, because although it's a very deadly virus for old people over the age of 60, it is, for example, according to data released last week from France, 1,000 times more deadly in an 80-year-old than in a 20-year-old. And the French data, for every 100,000 20-year-olds who were infected, 7 died. So there is a very small risk of death, but those risks that we have, those include people who have comorbidities, so 20, 25-year-olds who have diseases. We don't really know what the risks are in healthy people, and we also don't really know what the true rate of rare severe events might be. And just to compare some risks here, phase 1 trials of new drugs that are done in healthy volunteers have what arguably can be considered similar risks of hospitalization and occasionally death. And it's worth pointing out that other challenge studies, although they have an excellent safety record overall, are still at least sometimes associated with rare severe outcomes. For example, myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart muscle, has been noted in influenza and malaria challenge studies. Schistosomiasis challenge studies, which is a type of parasite, have caused a relatively severe form of Katayama fever in a participant, and other pathogens have caused various kinds of autoimmune arthritis. And it's worth pointing out that there is no specific curative treatment for myocarditis in those challenge studies. And so there are risks of even regular challenge studies that we need to be very careful about. Of course, even vaccines themselves carry risks, and certain vaccines in the past, including influenza vaccines, have led to neurological syndromes like Guillain-Barré. So in conclusion, the main concerns, despite the significant scientific justification for these studies, are about risks and uncertainty. So one concern is that people are worried that we can't be very confident about our risk estimates, but our confidence about that is increasing as we get more data. Another set of concerns are we don't know what the risk factors are for severe disease among young healthy adults, or if there are any, and we don't know about the rate of long-term risks and lasting harms after this infection. We don't know about the relationship between viral dose and the severity of illness, and there's current controversy about whether treatment is a necessary condition or whether it's a requirement for challenge studies. The motivation for treatment requirements are about risk and uncertainty fundamentally. Or an example, in this recent document published by some HIV experts, there was a perception that challenge studies should be restricted to cases where there either is treatment or where the pathogenesis and risks are reasonably well characterized. But importantly, specific treatment doesn't necessarily mean that there's no risk. So there's specific treatment for influenza, but there's still been cases of myocarditis. And also, although we think that we understand pathogens that we consider familiar, unlike SARS-CoV-2, actually in challenge studies, there's been a lot of unexpected findings in, for example, studies of influenza, dengue, schistosomiasis, and viavax. And so it's worth situating these studies in challenge studies as a whole to work out whether we think that they're more or less controversial than people believe. Thanks very much, and I'll hand over.
Great, thank you, Zeb, for a very helpful overview of the risks and uncertainty and the scientific issues here. So good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Seema Shah, and I'm delighted to be speaking with you. What I thought I would do is give you a brief overview of the guidance that we worked on together. Claudia was also involved in drafting the guidance, and discuss how each of the 8 ethical criteria interrelate, because I think that's something that may be missed on the first pass of reading through the guidance. And then finally, I'd like to relate them to the ongoing debate that's been raging in the academic literature and even in the media, so that there's a sense of where the WHO guidance fit in. The first point that I want to make is that the WHO guidance document doesn't take a position on whether human challenge studies with the novel coronavirus would be ethically acceptable. The document also doesn't rule out the use of these studies as clearly unethical. So I think that's an important step to recognize. There were 8 different criteria that were developed that were interrelated and also put into pairs. The first and most important is what Zeb has been discussing. So the first is that there is scientific justification or social value, as others describe it, for doing the trial. And this means that the research must be rigorous, well-designed to answer a valuable scientific question. So I won't belabor this because I think this is something we all think about, except to say this is the first question that needs to be addressed before a challenge study with the novel coronavirus could actually be ethically acceptable. And a big challenge here is how a particular, as Zeb was outlining, how within the vaccine development pathway a challenge study would actually fit in. As he mentioned, there are a few different proposals that are out there, and the most prominent is one of the most controversial in terms of how it would change a vaccine development pathway. So using challenge studies to replace efficacy trials is often considered controversial because of concerns about generalizability and worries that you may not see certain events until the vaccine is actually then released into the general population. So this is one potential concern. The other worry is that there's so much happening, and so much happening in parallel at the moment, that if it takes a few months to launch a challenge study, it may be too late. The train may have left the station in terms of allowing it to fit into what's already going on. But there are also really interesting and important questions that can be answered in challenge studies, as Zeb outlined, that could still be valuable even within the broader research ecosystem and even with what's happening. So the second issue that we discussed was the need to do risk-benefit assessment, and this requires identifying and minimizing risks and then making sure those risks are justified by social value. There's also some possibility that participants could receive benefit from being in a challenge study, although it's unclear and somewhat speculative at the moment. So in the guidance, we mostly emphasize the importance that the risks are justified by the social value. The third criterion that we discussed was consultation and engagement. And these criterion, I think, it's also worth noting, are designed to be addressed somewhat in stepwise progression, so that the first 2 really address whether it's worth doing the study, and the rest then should be applied to the process. And we thought consultation and engagement were a really critical step here. There are many people who might worry there's not enough time to do enough consultation, that engaging the public is very difficult in an environment where many of us are on lockdown, that it could be hard to meaningfully engage people through other means, such as social media. And I think while these are important considerations, it doesn't obviate the need for public engagement here. Challenge studies are not intuitive for the public. It is confusing to imagine that it's okay for researchers to take people who are healthy and deliberately infect them with a disease. And for this reason, we thought it was really important to have high quality public engagement happen. It could be tailored and targeted to groups who are in communities where challenge studies would be done, or to representative samples in order to get actual education before engagement and before finding out what the public's concerns are. But public engagement is really critical for identifying what the public's concerns might be and addressing them in developing a challenge study for the novel coronavirus. The fourth requirement that the fourth criterion that was laid out was the idea of coordination. And this is really the idea that as so much has been happening, as we've had this explosion of research into the novel coronavirus, it's really important to realize social value by having this coordination among different actors. So there are a few different people talking about doing challenge studies. Within those groups, it's important for them to be using the same metrics so that the small numbers of people who will be enrolled in each study can be amplified and data can be shared across different types of studies. It's also important to consider the relay race I mentioned earlier. So in order to realize social value, if it's the case that the challenge study results are meant to, say, achieve an improvement in public health practice, for instance, by identifying when people are protected against the disease, that may require coordination so that the results are actually taken forward to change public health practice. And if that's not there, then the social value of doing a trial really doesn't exist. The fifth criterion was to have site selection. So it's important to, we thought, because there are sites that have a lot of experience in doing challenge studies, that have sensitized the local communities to participating in challenge studies, that that will be a critical component of making sure that a challenge study is done carefully, quickly, and at the highest standards. We felt also it was important to ensure that the pandemic response was not compromised by conducting a challenge study in a particular place. So in order to minimize risks, as we mentioned earlier, you would need to ensure participants have access to all necessary care, including ventilators. It also would be important that study personnel have access to personal protective equipment. But both of those things are scarce. And the need to ensure that the scarcity that exists on the ground in a particular place is not exacerbated by bringing a challenge study into that place is really important. The sixth criterion was participant selection. So this was the idea that participants should be selected based on low relative risk, not on vulnerability or privilege. And we were also concerned that in some cases it might seem appropriate to take participants who are at higher background risk, because then the relative risk that they're being exposed to in a challenge study is lower. The one concern we had with that is that there might be cases where the higher background risk is due to injustice. In my city of Chicago, for instance, there certainly is a big gap between minority exposure and outcomes and white people's exposures and outcomes. And the challenge here is then to say that we shouldn't select people based on this idea that they're already exposed to higher risk based on an underlying systemic injustice. We also thought it was important that for the seventh criteria that expert review was conducted. And although there is standard research ethics review, and all of this is meant to add to standard research ethics precautions, one of the challenges is that standard research ethics committees may not be well equipped to address the ethics of challenge studies. In the Zika experience, when our panel reviewed the ethics of a Zika virus challenge trial, this had already gone through standard research ethics review. And one of the interesting things that happened after we published about it was we received an email from someone who was on the review committee who said that he had raised a question about third-party risks in the context of the review. And when he raised it, others told him that it really wasn't a concern. Whereas for us, is that when we did our review, that was really one of the central concerns and one of the reasons that we thought that a Zika virus challenge trial should be put on pause. So it does seem important to ensure that the Research Ethics Committee has relevant expertise, understands challenge studies, and understands the disease in question. Finally, we thought informed consent is really critical, which could include tests of comprehension, as are pretty much standard in challenge studies, but that the emphasis should be on addressing burdens, risks, and the uncertainties here, so that participants understand what they're getting into, and also that this information is updated as it evolves, as it likely will over the course of the study. So what I think is really important to take away from these criteria is first that the ongoing debate in the academic literature and in the news media hasn't really focused on all of these criteria. It's been sort of on the narrow question of, could we justify a challenge study potentially? And I think broadening the criteria is a really important contribution here, making it clear that addressing the ethics isn't as simple as saying this could make a difference, it could help, and the risks could be sufficiently low and people will give their consent. There's more to it than that. The second issue is really that the uncertainty in some ways hasn't really factored into that judgment as much as I think it could be useful. So in my own personal view, stepping back from the guidance, is that given all of the uncertainties about risk and social value, and the fact that it will take a few months to set up a challenge study, it makes sense to start laying the groundwork now for conducting coronavirus challenge studies, and then, challenge studies with the novel coronavirus. And then at a later point in time when those studies are ready to go, but before anyone is deliberately infected, at that point, a judgment should be made about whether those studies can actually contribute to what's happening, what the most important questions would be to design the studies around, and also what the risks are and whether they're minimized sufficiently. So that's my own personal view. One of the things I'd really like to see in this space, since we're talking to such a wide and interested audience who might be considering doing studies like this, is for someone to develop a consensus protocol that could be used in challenge studies, which could address the ethical criteria that are laid out here in the WHO's guidance document. Finally, I'll just note that we wrote the science paper, which some of you may have seen, and Claudia and Zeb were both authors on that paper. And it may be confusing that there are different criteria, and some of what's going on in the literature is that you'll see these different criteria or different names for things. I just wanted to clarify that in general, for the papers that all of us have been on, we have worked to ensure that all of these things are consistent with each other, that they all address all of the same issues, but in different ways. And so most of the differences are differences of terminology or emphasis. And I'd be happy to talk about specific issues that any of you might find interesting to discuss. But in general, I think there's a robust framework that could be used for addressing the ethics of doing a challenge study with the novel coronavirus. So with that, I will turn it over to Josh.
Thanks very much, Seema. Josh, you have the floor.
All right. Well, thank you, Seema and Zeb, for giving really helpful talks and overviews of the science and ethics. And thank you to the WHO for including me and us at One Day Sooner. It's just tremendously appreciated. And, you know, I think that we're sort of the kind of new kids on the block when it comes to challenge studies, and that what we're trying to do is a little bit novel and unusual. And so I am deeply appreciative of our being included in the discussion, because I think that given the tremendous investment in challenge trials, not just, you know, obviously for coronavirus being considered here, but also for their use in a number of different diseases and a number of different vaccines, you know, I think there's justifiably a lot of caution and concern about their use in coronavirus, and wanting to make sure that it doesn't damage their use in other places. And I think that, you know, for seeing kind of us as this kind of new entity, if I were, you know, experienced in the field, I might be a little bit nervous about that. So I definitely appreciate how welcoming groups like the WHO and other experts have been. And so yeah, definitely from the One Day Sooner volunteers, we're very thankful for that and for being included. So first, let me just sort of, what is One Day Sooner and what are our goals? So One Day Sooner is a group that advocates on behalf of COVID challenge trial volunteers, people who want to participate in a challenge trial for COVID-19. And as Claudia mentioned, we now have, I think, 23,000 volunteers as of today. It's from over 100 countries. For a while, the country with the greatest representation was actually Brazil. But I think that with, about 7,000 to 8,000 volunteers, I think this past week, America kind of pulled back into the lead. But it's very much a global group and a fairly diverse group. And, I'm actually working to co-author a paper with Seema about kind of a sort of research survey of our volunteers to get a sort of more rigorous sense for what they're like. But I definitely think from what we can tell, it's a younger group, seemingly in fairly good health on average, that there are people even in their 80s who volunteered, and also seemingly fairly well educated, with a lot of people talking about a biomedical or public health background. And so I mentioned before that our goal is to advocate on behalf of challenge trial volunteers. And I just want to note that's a different goal than advocating on behalf of the trials themselves, right? So we advocate for the volunteers and not for the trials. And so we don't take it as a settled matter. The challenge trials are definitely going to be useful or definitely going to be practical for COVID-19. We're optimistic, and we agree with Seema that there needs to be kind of the preparations should begin soon, because there is this enormous potential value. But I think that it's very easy to see, especially in the media, as being kind of, oh, challenge trials are amazing. For COVID-19, we need them immediately. That's not quite our view. Our view is that there's value in this kind of representation of challenge volunteers, and that's mostly what I'm going to talk about today. And I hope that it's not, kind of rude or self-aggrandizing to kind of focus on the nature of our new organization. But I do so because there's sort of two main things I want to discuss. And the first one connects very much to what we're doing and how that's a little bit novel, I think, which is that I think it's important to kind of center volunteer autonomy and agency in the decisions surrounding human challenge trials. And so, my basic thesis in what I'm going to say is that I thought that the WHO ethical framework and the work of Seema's and Zeb's and many others that it builds off of was quite robust and really well considered and very thoughtful. But I do think it's incomplete in a couple of ways, and I want to kind of talk about that. And the first, I basically right now want to focus on kind of two aspects of including volunteer autonomy. One is the idea of volunteers or building institutions that give volunteers agency over the challenge trial process. And the second is thinking about the role of volunteer autonomy in relation to kind of ethical considerations around that process. That was kind of the first half or so of what I'm going to say. So the first on this kind of agency question in challenge trial design. I think, our idea is that the sort of basic thought here is that if you empower volunteers in the policy process, that's going to help assist in managing the ethical concerns about risking these volunteers' health. And kind of stepping back and thinking about medical research in general, I think that it's naturally the case that the participants in medical research are generally the least empowered in that research. They're the least expert. They're the most vulnerable. They didn't design the studies themselves. In some ways, they're almost a bit of kind of like the hired help. There's a bit of a kind of commodity to the subjects. And that means, I think as a result, it's very rightfully the case that in medical research, we try to take extraordinary measures to make sure that the test subjects are protected. And there's a lot of ways in place to do that. In particular, the idea of institutional review boards or IRBs are meant to protect these vulnerable participants. And so my argument, and the argument of One Day Sooner, is that this process could be improved if you could help build institutions that could represent the volunteers more and test participants more, giving them agency in that process. Because right now you're kind of using IRBs and other agents as imperfect agents of the principals who are the volunteers being subjected to risk. And the more that you can kind of give volunteers a voice, and give them control over the actual process itself, the better they're going to be able to manage the risk themselves and be able to usefully steer away from bad outcomes than if you have an agent working on their behalf. And so that's part of this idea of One Day Sooner, is that given the enormous ethical complexity, or particularly the significant risk of challenge trials for COVID-19, that this is a kind of an ideal time to try to think about, well, what are creative ways we can do to sort of manage that risk in an interesting way and in a productive way. And one of them is this idea of, figuring out, okay, well, what is it that people who want to participate in these trials want? How do we inform them properly with expert guidance? And how do we channel their autonomy into the system in an effective way? And so that's kind of what our goal is. And that's something that we would urge be included in the decision-making process for this more broadly. So then my second point here is about thinking about volunteers and think about how we should take the autonomy of volunteers seriously when we decide the ethical considerations around these challenge trials. There's a woman I spoke with who's a challenge volunteer who's middle-aged. Her name's Faith Lamb. She published a piece in Bloomberg, and she said that she's in her 50s, but she thinks that she should be able to participate in a challenge trial, even though it is riskier, because she thinks that it's that it could have greater scientific value, and ultimately that it should be her choice to do that. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective, and I think that what I think is that clearly there shouldn't be challenge trials, even if there were willing and well-informed participants, if they weren't likely to have a social benefit. But I do think we need to consider carefully the paternalism inherent in rejecting people who want to participate in a challenge trial if that challenge trial is likely to have a significant social benefit. And I think, as the name of our organization implies, to us, what a significant benefit means is having like a clear likelihood of accelerating vaccine deployment one day sooner, or, other sort of equivalent, having a more effective vaccine or things like that. We think, even one day, we hope that we can get more than one day, even one day would be quite valuable. So I think we need to think a little bit carefully about under what grounds we would reject people who would want to participate in those studies if those studies would actually have social value. So that was the sort of first piece. The second piece I want to talk about is centering kind of on the goals of the ethical review process and the importance of avoiding delay. And so what I'd start here is I think that it's important for ethicists to sort of turn the lens inward in a way and think about their own power and the sort of power of the ethical review process in scientific research generally, and over people who want to participate in that research over society. Because I think that a lot of times ethical standards are kind of, think about power dynamics as things that other people have and other people are subjected to. But I think we should think a little bit carefully about that, and to use a kind of academic term, sort of problematize the role in the policymaking process. And so one thing, I think that the specific case I would say here, the specific rule I think is relevant, and it goes to some of the points that have been raised about the potential delays for challenge trials and the need for very try to, if these things are going to be useful, we want them available as soon as possible. So I think the right ethical rule here is that it should be a key principle that the ethical review of these trials should not unnecessarily delay their scientific or practical development should they prove useful. Or putting it a little more precisely, any delays that would be introduced by an ethical review process would need quite compelling justification, given the potential value and given the need to try to get these available if they're going to be useful as soon as possible. And I think obviously there's a kind of utilitarian perspective here, which is that obviously the benefits are going to be greater if they're implemented earlier. But actually, I think there's a deeper point, which is I think there's something that we, the medical system and the people doing challenge trials, owe to the participants specifically, which is and this goes to the first of the criteria laid out in the WHO document, is that it's important that these trials be as useful as possible. And I think that, for every increment of risk that volunteers are subjected to, I think we owe it to them that risk is most optimally used, is most helpful to the system in general. And so I think if that's true, that means that we owe volunteers having the most effective system possible. And that also means trying to make it sort of, the idea that it should be available early consistent with science, consistent with it being as well designed as possible. And now, to be clear, none of that is to say that I think we should rush the ethical consideration of this complicated and important issue. Instead, I'm merely arguing that that the ethical considerations proceed in parallel with the scientific process and development, and that it's important that that there's not sort of additional time taken because of ethical consideration. And maybe I'm just sort of cranky from sort of the interminable delays we've had trying to get our research survey out from dealing with the IRB. But I do think that idea of thinking about the sort of this meta principle of how ethical considerations and the ethical decision-making process affect challenge trials and affect the timing is something that's important. And I think what I would say is I would kind of conclude right around where Seema kind of concludes, that I don't think we want to not put ourselves in a situation where 3 months from now there's broad agreement that conducting challenge trials are really valuable, that they're ethically and scientifically the best chance at fighting COVID-19, only to find that we're still months away from being able to implement them due to our failure to prepare the adequate foundation. And so that's something that we at One Day Sooner are working on, is trying to get the process of production of the virus under what's called good manufacturing practices, which is kind of the first step to doing a challenge trial. We're trying to make sure that happens as soon as possible, and are working with vendors to do that. But I think we as a field in general need to be thinking about how to make these available and available quickly, and what the right role in the ethics process is doing. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Josh, and thanks Zeb and Seema for those excellent presentations. So not surprisingly, we have a lot of questions from our audience. Thank you for the engagement. And because we only have about 10 minutes left, I'm going to try and get through as many of those questions as we possibly can. So we'll start with some sort of short, quick ones. Unsurprisingly, a lot of questions surrounding risk and what kind of risk is allowable, third-party risk, how we have to manage risk. So I'm going to lob 2 quick questions at you, Zeb. So one question is around, the containment facility. So you mentioned that in the guidance that one of the things that we indicated is to do this in facilities where there is experience and a track record, and where there is, the ability to monitor carefully and treat patients who are being challenged. And so one of our audience members asked that whether that should be a BSL-3, Biosafety Containment Lab Level 3 for SARS-CoV-2, or whether that would be BSL-2, such as we would have with other pathogens and other challenge studies that we do.
So yeah, it's a great question. It's a standard requirement for challenge studies that there's minimization of risk to third parties or bystanders. And the working group took a view that was particularly important for this pathogen because of the potential disastrous consequences related to an outbreak. So the third-party risk reduction strategies would have to include participants staying for quite a long period of time as inpatients. The general view at the moment is at least 3 weeks. And yeah, the person who asked the question about what type of facility exactly does raise a practical difficulty for challenge studies, because so few facilities are authorized to have pathogens that are rated so-called BSL-3 or very high-risk pathogens. So that does pose some practical constraints, to which some people have responded, well, we need to build more facilities that would be able to do that if this research is so valuable, and if reducing risks to others is so valuable, which many people agree that it is. Over.
Great, thanks very much, Zeb. I want to pick up on that last point, which touches on some of the last point, Josh, that you made, or actually the last 2 points around this notion of agency and autonomy, and participants who are willing and able to freely provide informed consent to participate in challenge studies, and this notion of how we set those thresholds for risk, and trying to sort of curtail elements of paternalism where we're trying to protect participants from harm. And in some ways, this ties back to a few questions that we've had from the audience, and something that Seema raised in her presentation, and something that comes up in the WHO guidance and as well in Seema's paper, around engagement. So in some ways, the engaging with participants, at that level where you could promote and maximize autonomy by allowing them to participate is one way. So one day sooner in some ways is doing that through engagement. But we have a question from the audience around, what is the best way to engage for something like this in the context of a pandemic? In a situation where we have uncertainty and so much risk, what is the best way to engage? Seema, I'll let you weigh in on that, and then Josh, I invite you to sort of give me your thoughts on how that plays into this notion of agency and autonomy that you've spoken about.
So thanks, Claudia. I think this is a really tough challenge, and public engagement and the best way to do it for research generally is not something people have entirely solved elsewhere, right? It depends on what it is you care about finding out from the public, what the goal is of public engagement, although of course public engagement can have intrinsic value in and of itself. And then it also depends on what the best methods are of trying to share information. I think one of the big challenges that people talk about in the literature is that we don't really know what constitutes good public engagement because we don't have metrics of how you can tell when you've achieved the goals of doing a certain type of public engagement. There are, of course, excellent examples of innovative approaches to public engagement. So Dorcas Kamuya and others at Emory have developed a really robust method of engagement around challenge trials, where they also have a sort of mini legislature of from the community who weighs in on various issues from that the researchers have from even before studies are contemplated to all the way after they are completed. In my view, one of the most important components of public engagement here is trying to ensure that it's done in a way where you get meaningful responses and concerns from the public, so that there's some educational component of that engagement. I think a lot of the media conversation has already started to get the public thinking about this, and in some ways sort of captured the imagination of the captive audience of people who are under lockdown. But I think that more engagement could involve research where people are informed about a potential coronavirus challenge study, and then data are collected on what their concerns are so that those concerns could be addressed. So that's certainly one approach that I think could be really useful here. A virtual community advisory board could also be another approach where diverse representation on this board could provide information that would be useful to designing studies. And I just wanted to make a couple of quick comments on Josh's points. So Alan Wertheimer and others have argued that research ethics is inherently a soft paternalistic enterprise, that we don't just let people make decisions based on what they think is right? We have review committees who stand in between them and the research, who look at research carefully to make sure that it's appropriate. And perhaps one justification for that is just that research is complicated. These issues of social value do require a certain amount of sorting through what is it that a challenge study can contribute to what's already going on, which is difficult and maybe too much to expect any individual volunteer to be able to figure that out on their own. So many volunteers in different kinds of studies will say that the fact that there is research ethics review is something that they consider valuable and helpful to them. There might be other people who are very well informed, like you, Josh, and like many of the people who are part of your group. But even then, I think there are justifications that would also appeal to consequentialists, which is that if public trust in the research enterprise is damaged by participating in a trial where the risks are really high and there is death, for instance, that would be something that would have wide-ranging repercussions for other studies in the future, and that could limit our ability to conduct valuable research later on. And that matters for all of us. And so we're all invested in making sure that research is conducted in the right way, with the right standards, and safely. So this is, I think, maybe something that would be worth, I'm curious to hear what you think about that, or I'm sure you've thought about it, Josh, and I'll stop there.
So we are just coming up on the hour with 4 minutes. We're going to have to wrap up. So Josh, what I'm going to do is just ask you, yes or no, do you think that one day sooner is actually a form of engagement for human challenge studies in your perspective based on some of the things that you talked about?
Yes. Should I elaborate on that or just say yes?
One
No,
elaboration, please. Thank you.
yeah. So just briefly, and I think it exactly goes to Seema's point. I think those are both very well taken points. I think those are very good observations, and that's why it kind of goes back to an argument I was making earlier about wanting to kind of build the right. What we need is to build the right institutions. And one piece here is an institution to kind of channel volunteer consent in a certain way, which is kind of what One Day Sooner is trying to do. And similarly, trying to build channel. But the theory is that by doing that, you can better build public trust, right? And I think that thinking carefully and as Seema mentioned, with these different ideas that we want to be informing, want to be kind of gauging sentiment through different ideas of kind of polling or virtual community advisory boards. That's all valuable, and I think that given the enormous publicity around this very ethically fraught issue, I think it's actually a perfect opportunity to figure out how to build these institutions to engage the public more effectively in ways that can be useful for other medical research as well.
Great, thank you. All right, so we're almost out of time and we have so many questions. I might want to propose to the Global Health Network and to FEPRIN to invite our panelists back and just have a Q&A with all the excellent questions. We didn't get through things around payment, which was in Seema's paper. I invite you to, if you haven't seen the paper already, there is actually discussing there on payment, which is interesting with the number of volunteers who have come forward who are willing to participate in human challenge studies. Also, this question of generalizability, which Zeb had mentioned, and the question of not having a treatment. We had several questions around, and Zeb had mentioned that the lack of having an effective treatment is not a reason to not conduct human challenge studies. They're still ethically defensible, all things considered, provided those scientific and ethical standards are met. So just to wrap up, I want to remind everyone that this was recorded and available to go back and to check and to share with your colleagues. There will also be a write-up of this webinar, and there will also be other resources if you are interested in human challenge studies for COVID-19. There are other resources, as I said, total of over 700 on the Global Health Network for COVID-19 specifically, and many of those relate to this very interesting topic. I want to thank all of our panelists today, Zeb, Seema, Josh, thank you so much for your participation and for dialing in today. I want to thank Catherine Littler and PFREN and the Global Health Network. Thanks very much, everyone, and to all of the audience for your engaged questions. I'm sorry we couldn't take them all, but perhaps we will have the opportunity another time. Thank you.